Imagine voluntarily stepping into a steel coffin, a metal tube 76 meters long and less than 5 meters in diameter. 50 men, 52 days at sea. No sunlight, no fresh air, no room to walk, no privacy, no escape. And then, someone detects you. Depth charges begin to fall. The hull groans. The lights go out. Freezing water begins to seep through the rusted seams of the hatches. And the commander, with eyes that have already seen too much, looks at his crew and says in a low voice, almost a whisper, "Absolute silence, not a sound. Because if the enemy crew up there hears anything at all, you're dead." Welcome to real life inside a German U-boat during World War II. This is not fiction, not a Hollywood dramatization. This is what happened. Repeatedly, for years, with men who were between 17 and 25 years old, many of whom didn't even know how to shave when they volunteered for this service. And the most disturbing part of all? More than 70% of them never came home. Stay until the end. Because what you're about to discover about the conditions inside these submarines will completely change the way you see the war. And it may make you question something far darker. What drives a human being to voluntarily accept what is almost a death sentence? The year is 1939. Nazi Germany has just invaded Poland, and the world plunges into the largest armed conflict in human history. But while tanks thunder across Europe and bombers tear through the skies, there is a completely different war taking place, an invisible war. A war in the dark depths of the Atlantic Ocean. Karl Dönitz, the admiral commanding Germany's submarine fleet, the Kriegsmarine, had a plan. A plan that almost worked. A plan that left Winston Churchill awake at night in a cold sweat. The idea was simple in theory, devastating in practice. Starve Britain. Great Britain was an island. It depended entirely on maritime supply routes to receive food, fuel, weapons, and soldiers from America. Cut those routes, and Britain would starve before any invasion was needed. And for that, Dönitz had his U-boat, the Unterseeboot, the undersea boats. Between 1939 and 1945, Germany built 1,154 U-boats. These submarines sank more than 3,500 Allied ships. They killed more than 72,000 sailors. They created such deep terror across the oceans that in 1942, the Allies genuinely feared the war might be lost. But here is the side of the story history books rarely show. While the U-boats hunted Allied ships, death was hunting the hunters as well. To understand the psychological terror of serving on a U-boat, you first need to understand what that machine actually was. The Type 7 U-boat, the most common model used during the war, measured roughly 67 to 76 meters long. That sounds large, doesn't it? Now imagine that most of those 76 meters are filled with engines, batteries, torpedoes, fuel tanks, and technical equipment. The real living space for the crew? Just a fraction of that. 50 men shared a space smaller than a one-bedroom apartment. The control room was the brain of the operation, a cramped cylinder from which the commander observed the ocean through the periscope. When the submarine dived, this was where life or death decisions were made. Every square inch was packed with instruments, valves, and levers. 2 men could barely turn around at the same time. Just below the conning tower lay the mechanical heart of the vessel. Valves controlling ballast tanks, pressure gauges, gyro compasses. The men stationed here worked in absolute silence during attacks, exchanging glances that said everything. A single miscalculation could send them to a depth from which no submarine could return. And this is where the true horror begins. Sleeping quarters is a generous phrase. There were bunks, but not enough bunks. Submariners practiced a system known as hot-bunking. 2 men shared the same bed in shifts. When you woke up, the other man immediately took your place. The mattress never cooled. You slept in the sweat of the man who had just left. And those bunks? They were literally next to the torpedoes. Men slept with live warheads as their roommates. When submerged, the submarine was completely cut off from the outside world. Oxygen was consumed by electric engines and the breathing of 50 men. Carbon dioxide built up. Humidity reached 100%. Condensation ran down the metal walls like sweat. Clothes never dried. Bread molded within days. Men developed skin infections, respiratory problems, and a ghostly pale complexion that Dönitz's sailors grimly nicknamed the U-boat face. Hollow eyes, gray skin, the expression of someone who had seen something impossible to describe. Forget the romantic image of a sailor staring at the horizon. Inside a U-boat, there was no horizon, no windows, no clear distinction between day and night. The only indicator of time was the clock on the wall and the shift that was beginning or ending. The routine followed 4-hour watches, 4 hours on duty, 8 hours off. Though off-duty rarely meant real rest. During those hours, you repaired equipment, cleaned components, studied navigation charts, or tried to sleep while the diesel engines vibrated the metal around you like an instrument of torture. 4 a.m. The U-boat travels on the surface under the cover of darkness. Lookouts in the tower sweep the horizon with binoculars. Every shadow could be a destroyer. Every sound could be the beginning of the end. 6 a.m. Breakfast, margarine, rye bread already starting to mold by the 10th day, and canned coffee. The crew eats in silence. The younger men still try to make jokes. The veterans simply eat. 12 p.m. lunch, the most important meal for morale. The cook, the Coke, was often one of the most respected men on board, not because of rank, but because hot food was the only consistent comfort available. 2 p.m. The commander spots smoke on the horizon. An enemy merchant ship. Silence falls across the submarine like a blanket. Men move into position. In the silence before the attack, each man is alone with his thoughts. Every one of them knows that by attacking, they are also revealing themselves. And revealing themselves means becoming the target. The U-boats had what Germans later called Die glückliche Zeit, the happy time, between 1940 and 1941. Submarines attacked in coordinated groups using the famous wolf pack tactics. 5, 10, sometimes 15 U-boats would strike entire convoys at once. But the war changed. The Allies developed ASDIC sonar. Long-range aircraft began patrolling the Atlantic. The Enigma codes were broken. Suddenly, the hunters became the hunted. A depth charge exploded with carefully calculated pressure designed to crush a submarine's hull, but rarely on the first try, which meant the U-boat crew had to wait, waiting for the next explosion, and the next, and the next. Survivors described the sound of a nearby detonation as the end of the world itself. The entire hull would contract. Instruments would fall from the walls. Light bulbs would shatter. Water pressure would spike, forcing valves and joints. Objects flew through the interior. Men were thrown against metal surfaces. And then, silence. The silence was almost worse than the explosion, because in the silence you could hear the hiss of water entering, the groaning of metal under pressure, the quiet sobbing of a wounded sailor trying to control his fear, and the ping of enemy sonar above you, still searching. The commander would order minimum speed. The crew moved in socks without shoes, communicating only through hand gestures. No one spoke. No one coughed. If someone needed the bathroom, there were buckets. There are records of U-boats that remained sitting on the ocean floor for more than 30 hours while a patient destroyer waited above. 30 hours. In darkness. In silence. 50 men breathing the same poisoned air. Modern military psychology would classify many of the conditions aboard a U-boat as torture because of their psychological effects. Chronic sleep deprivation, extreme confinement, lack of privacy, constant existential uncertainty, and repeated exposure to trauma. The men developed what we would now recognize as PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, in real time, inside the submarine itself. There were hallucinations. Reports exist of men who, after days of depth charge attacks, began hearing voices, seeing things in the shadows. Commander Heinrich Lehmann Willenbrock described in his memoirs the moment he realized that one of his best men had quietly broken. The man simply stopped responding to orders. Not out of rebellion. He simply went somewhere else, inside himself. The best U-boat commanders had a peculiar ability, the capacity to project absolute calm in situations of absolute panic. They knew that if they broke, everyone would break. So they built around themselves an aura of invulnerability that was, in essence, a performance of collective survival. But there was a price. After the war, many of these commanders were broken men in ways no one around them could see. Functional, perhaps even successful in civilian life, but irreparably marked. In 1942, the Allies broke the German Enigma codes, specifically the naval codes, thanks to the work of cryptographers at Bletchley Park, including the brilliant Alan Turing. What did that mean in practice? It meant the Allies knew where the U-boats were. They knew the routes. They knew the resupply points in the Atlantic, the so-called Milchkühe, the milk cows, supply submarines. They knew the attack plans. But here is the disturbing dilemma. If the Allies acted on every piece of information obtained from the Enigma codes, the Germans would realize their codes had been compromised and change everything. So the Allies were forced to make impossible choices: when to act and when to let events unfold, to preserve the most valuable secret of the war. There are historians who argue, with growing documentation, that there were Allied convoys that were attacked even when the British knew the attack was coming, because revealing that they knew would have compromised the entire intelligence operation. And the U-boat crews themselves? They had no idea that their positions were often known even before they reached their patrol areas, that the destroyer hunting them had been sent to that exact position by perfect intelligence. They died without knowing the game was rigged. Let's talk about numbers, because sometimes the coldness of numbers is more terrifying than any narrative. 1,154 U-boats were built by Nazi Germany. 863 were destroyed during the conflict. 30,000 men of the Kriegsmarine served in the U-boats. 28,000 died. That is a mortality rate of roughly 75%, the highest of any military service of any nation during the Second World War. For comparison, the mortality rate for American fighter pilots was about 12%. The mortality rate for infantry soldiers in combat ranged from 8 to 15%. And they knew it. There are records of young recruits being explicitly warned by veterans, "Das Meer ist keine Freundin." The sea is not a friend. It was a coded euphemism. Everyone understood what it meant. Even more disturbing, as the war went on, the Kriegsmarine had increasing difficulty finding volunteers. And then, not everyone was a volunteer. Documentation exists of men being transferred into submarine service without a choice, especially in the final years of the war. Men who knew they were being sent to their own execution, mission after mission. Werner Henke, Erich Topp, Wolfgang Luth, Günther Prien. These names were legends within the Kriegsmarine. U-boat aces, decorated with the Knight's Cross. Their faces appeared in propaganda magazines. Most of them died at sea. Günther Prien, the Bull of Scapa Flow, the man who penetrated the British naval base at Scapa Flow and sank the battleship Royal Oak in 1939, disappeared in March 1941. His U-boat, U-47, was never found. 45 men, dissolved into the Atlantic. But there is a lesser-known story that echoes in a more disturbing way. U-869. It sank in February 1945 in waters off the coast of New Jersey in the United States. For 50 years, no one knew where it was. The families of the crew had no grave to visit, no official date of death. Only absence. In 1991, amateur divers found it. Inside were still the skeletal remains of part of the crew. Identification tags, personal belongings, family photographs floating in sealed compartments that had preserved fragments of these men's lives for half a century. Young men in their 20s, pictures of girlfriends, letters home that were never sent. And here is the detail that makes it even darker. Later analysis showed that U-869 was possibly destroyed by its own torpedoes that circled back, a technical failure documented in other U-boats. They died by their own weapons, alone, in American waters, with family photographs in their pockets. And no one knew for 50 years. Why does this story matter? Why 80 years later are we still fascinated by the U-boats? There is something in the narrative of German submarines that goes beyond military history. Something that touches fundamental questions about human nature. First, the human capacity to adapt to the unbearable. These men lived in conditions that any modern psychology expert would classify as intolerable. And yet they did not simply survive. They functioned. They maintained social bonds, developed dark humor, created rituals inside the metal tube to preserve something resembling humanity. Second, the question of moral conscience in wartime. These men sank ships, with crews aboard, sometimes civilians. Most surviving diaries show men who processed this in profoundly different ways. Some with complete dissociation, others with guilt that followed them for decades. Third, and perhaps most disturbing, the system that creates perpetrators. Most U-boat crewmen were not fanatical Nazis. They were young Germans who had grown up in the Weimar Republic, shaped by a system that glamorized war, men with families and dreams and fears like anyone else. The system put them inside steel coffins. The system sent them to kill. The system killed them. And they went. Because that is the deepest and most universal horror of war. In 1945, the war was lost. Everyone knew it. The admirals knew. The commanders knew. Perhaps even the 17-year-old recruits knew, even if they never said it out loud. But the U-boats kept going out on missions. In April 1945, with Germany burning, with Hitler dead in his bunker, with the Soviets in Berlin, U-boats were still being sent into the Atlantic. Missions with no strategic purpose. Missions everyone knew would not change the outcome of the war. Karl Dönitz, now Chancellor of Germany by Hitler's testament, needed time to negotiate surrender with the Western Allies. Every day his U-boats continued to sail was another day of negotiation. The men inside those submarines were pieces in a political chess game they could not see. The last U-boat to sink an Allied ship was U-853 in May 1945, days before Germany's official surrender. It was destroyed shortly afterward. In total, during the last 3 months of the war, the Kriegsmarine lost 109 U-boats, with their crews, for nothing, to buy days of political negotiation. Numbers do not lie. The stories do not lie. The diaries preserved on the floor of the Atlantic do not lie. What the U-boats of the Second World War left us is not just military history. It is a mirror reflecting what happens when powerful systems turn human beings into tools. When propaganda and nationalism create young men willing to enter steel coffins for the glory of a regime that will consume them without hesitation. When we look at those black and white photographs, young faces, many smiling, many proudly posing beside their U-boats before departing on missions from which 75% would never return. We are not looking at monsters. We are looking at mirrors. Because what turns an ordinary human being into someone capable of living and dying under those conditions, capable of killing and dying for systems that destroy them, is not something unique to Germany in 1939. It is something that must be understood, studied, recognized, so that never again, anywhere in the world, 17-year-old boys step smiling into steel coffins believing they are heroes, while the men who sent them there sleep peacefully on solid ground. Rest in peace to the 28,000 who never returned. May the Atlantic guard their stories.